Hi, welcome to Economics. We are back with another live episode this week. And before we start our episode, I would like to talk to you about the fact that we are getting into the festival, Diwali festival week. We've just passed through Dasera and talk all the talk has been about how the economy is recovering, and there are green shoots and shoots of revival. The finance minister talked about that in several interviews, and I would like to bring up the issue about how the media is coping with the downturn and how it has been difficult for the media to make ends meet during this pandemic and the lockdown. So my appeal to you is, why don't you spread some cheer during this festive season and take subscriptions in the print? We have been trying to do some good journalism over the last 3 years since we've been doing journalism here at the print. And the best way and the easiest way for us to be able to take this good journalism forward is when people like you are very valued subscribers take subscriptions and pay for what you read and watch. So my appeal to you during this festive season is, spread some cheer, go to the print.in/subscribe and take subscriptions. You will be doing a great deal of help for good journalism to stay alive and thrive. So what are we talking about this week? This week, there was over the last few months, there has been talk about starting an urban component to MGNREGA or MGNREGA, Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act or scheme. This proposal has been discussed in the government. There have been reports that the government has been considering something like this to help people who have lost jobs in the cities due to the pandemic and the lockdown. From what we have known in the last few weeks is the government is not keen to push this ahead for a series of various reasons, but the biggest reason being that it's a funds crunch situation for the government where it cannot uh, go ahead and launch something like this because it needs massive amounts of money. And this is not such a great idea, is what Professor Ila Patnaik says. And that's what she's written this week in her column. And we will be discussing this. And this is something which many of you also asked us to talk about and write about. So please send in questions as we take this discussion forward. So, Ila, you called it a band-aid, a quick band-aid to the situation. Why do you use the word that it's just a band-aid?
I want to distinguish between things that have long term benefits and things that are there for the short term and will help in the short term. So it is a band aid because it will help in the short term. People have lost their jobs, undoubtedly, because of COVID. They have lost their jobs in cities where, they have been living, and many of them have settled in cities and they've lost their jobs. And then now they can't even go back to villages, so they have to be accommodated somehow, and some livelihood has to be provided to them. In the immediate relief period, under the Atmanirbhar package and various other relief measures that were given, they were given food, or people, charitable as well as other institutions, helped out with food. And that was the immediate measure because the people were hungry and you had to give them food and they were walking towards their villages. But now when we think of an interim measure, I call it a band-aid because yes, it will solve today's problem. It will give them some livelihood, but the very same people, and a lot more than just those people, many others as well, will actually could, I should say, actually see a long-term consequence of such a strategy, of such a policy, which may not benefit them. Because if the policy ends up letting a lot more people think that they can go to villages, they can move from villages to cities, regardless of the demand for labor, regardless of whether they have skills or not, because they'll get a manrega sort of, dig holes and fill them up in cities. And if they start moving to cities, hoping that, okay, we'll at least be able to live there, even though we don't fit in, it could lead to a lot of pressure. As we discussed last time, cities are already bursting at the seams. Look at the health system. Today, even today, you have more people come in, more people will fall ill. Do our cities have enough ICU beds? And this is even in the middle of the pandemic. So this is not even the long term consequence. I'm just saying that long term in the sense that it will encourage people to come. But even if they stay today and they don't go back, cities are far more dangerous. We've been talking about this YP for a very long time, right when from February onwards, that if you have to choose, if a country has to be safer as a country as a whole, do you want people to be in crowded uh, conditions in the city, or would you rather that it'll their own life and safety if they go back? Of course, we want them to go back in humane conditions, not walk back, but they'll be better off in villages than in cities, which is why there was a additional emphasis on the rural manrega.
Mhm.
So that
And you have also made a distinction between the rural Manrega and urban Manrega, and that's a very fine distinction you've made. Would you want to tell our viewers about that? Because rural Manrega has been around for about a decade now, and it seems to be helping in a lot of places.
So one point that my co-author Radhika Pandey and I have emphasized in this is the nature of the work that you do under Manrega. Now, in Manrega, the work that you do is mostly labor intensive. In fact, initially the capital content of that work was very, very low. Then it started being felt that why not use it for infrastructure building and building assets in rural areas. And there was a little bit of an increase in the capital content. But if you think about the kind of work opportunities for say building any kind of assets in urban areas, you can't just make dirt roads. You'll have to put at least bricks, if, or cement or cobblestones, or some tar, or you'll have to put in more. You can't just be digging holes and filling them up. In other words, the amount of capital required to employ each worker in urban areas will be much more. So it cannot be the kind of workfare program that Manrega has been in rural areas, where capital required is less, where you can do some sort of meaningful asset building. Uh, Otherwise, if all you want to do is dig holes and fill them up, then you might as well just do direct benefit transfers. You might just do transfers to people who need money, rather than trying to create this whole program of giving them suitable work that they demand.
But the larger issue here, Ila, you're pointing out, is also towards the condition of our cities and the fact that they cannot take more people. We don't have infrastructure, whether it's physical infrastructure, whether it is services, and that is a failure, right?
Yeah, so this issue that cities neither have the funds nor the functionaries, okay, they don't have the power many times to be able to govern cities well. It has been a major issue. So for the last 10 or 12 years, there have been, committee reports on this. In fact, Dr. Isha Jajaluwalia, who passed away recently, used to talk about this issue quite a lot, and she wrote quite a lot about it. The fact that our cities are suffering, our cities are not able to provide water, sanitation, electricity, housing, roads, health, education, law and order, justice, almost everything that is the role of the local government in a city. These cities are not able to provide it. So often, it goes back to questions of money, but very often it also goes back to questions of accountability. That, other than Delhi, where the state government is also the city government, and so you have like a mayor who you hold responsible. So you look upon that person, the chief minister of the city, to govern the city. Other than that, you have states where sorry, where cities have their chief ministers coming from the state government, in that sense, and nobody knows even the name of the mayor of the city, because they don't have any powers. And there is a political tilt towards rural areas, because that's where a lot of votes come from.
Mhm.
So because of that, talking about Bombay, there has been a lot of work done on how the city needs so much more and is not able to provide those. So one main point that we are making here is that unless you have good governance systems in cities, unless they have the funds to build the infrastructure, the civic amenities, the solid waste management, just even to keep a city clean, unless all that is there, setting up a policy which keeps people in cities, which attracts more people to cities, can be very risky in the long term. It's
And then there is the issue of funds, Zila. I mean, you quoted a study by Azim Premji University, which said that an urban Narega would cost 4,50,000 crores, and that's not small change. And you don't have enough opportunities, enough infrastructure, and you spend 4,50,000 crores. That's not money you want to send down the drain.
Yeah, so first is the amount of money that you need. Now, when the Rural Manrega program was started, there were questions about how much money will it require. And at that time, I'm just doing a compare and contrast,
Mhm.
because, we've been through this story partly before. But at that time, one of the arguments that was made was that, you see, people are moving naturally, not because of these policies, but simply because of industrialization, because of the process of development of the economy, that people are moving from rural areas to urban areas. So slowly, the pressure will actually go down and the expenditure required will not balloon as it might. Now, think about this situation. It's actually exactly the opposite. People are moving towards urban areas. Over years, countries become more and more urbanized. If you even if, let's say, it's not because of this policy, but even if normally you thought about just people moving to urban areas, and you having to, you giving them a workfare program like this, you need a lot of resources. I mean, you need resources. So the countries like the US or the UK have unemployment doles. So effectively, in the limit, that is what you would be proposing. And for a very large population, for an economy that is not producing the kind of tax resources that you need, so it's very unaffordable.
Mhm.
At
So,
least at this stage of development, it is
mhm.
very unaffordable.
So one last question from me before we take many of the questions that are coming from our viewers, Ila. Uh, then ultimately, it all boils down to the fact that how do you create jobs? Because jobs have been lost and people have become unemployed in the last 6, 7 months. And the CMIE data we seem to be getting is all a little bit of a mixture of numbers, a roller coaster. Some jobs are getting created, people are falling out of the labor force. Uh, how do you create jobs?
The question of how you create jobs is not new to COVID. The question was already there. So, part of the answer is that you create jobs by creating conditions for businesses to work, for people to be able to set up companies, for them to be able to operate them without being harassed by a lot of, license requiring or a lot of permissions to be required, where the tax authorities uh, give you an easy system and are non-discretionary, where there is genuinely good ease of doing business, setting up and doing business. So that's one part of the answer, and that always remains true. So you government needs to do all that, build the right amount of infrastructure, have the right kind of policies, and so on.
Mhm,
I think another part of the answer that is specific to the present condition, which is the COVID condition, is that we need to be able to do as much as possible. The government needs to be able to do as much as possible to ensure safety,
mhm,
to have rules and regulations in place. I mean, I think that actually we've not done so badly compared to other countries. Now, if you look at, of course, there are countries that have done better, certainly smaller countries that have done better. But if you look at the country of our size and, the kind of predictions that we used to have that everybody would be, that by now there would be mass graves around, uh, we've not really, that hasn't happened. And part of the reason why it hasn't happened, I think, is because we've tried to enforce masks, we've tried to enforce some of those, just social distancing, keeping away, not shaking hands, uh, being safe, and yet trying to get back to work.
mhm,
So at least so far so good, keeping our fingers crossed, but so
mhm.
far so good that we have been able to create conditions, and we need to keep doing more of that. I mean, today there was an interview by a health expert saying that actually masks help much more
Than
than we had
anything
thought.
else. Yeah.
So we just need to keep doing all of those things to get people back to work.
Mhm. So let's start taking some questions, Ela. We have Tarush Kakar. Tarush is a very regular, loyal viewer of Elanomics. Thanks, Tarush. Really appreciate your engagement with the print and Elanomics. Uh, his question, Ela, is that instead of MGNREGA, should the government end all the subsidies, such as food subsidies, electric subsidies, and start the point you were saying, just start universal basic income, start paying people in their bank accounts?
Tarush, thanks first of all for your question. Uh, I mean, if there was no politics in the country, then a lot of subsidies wouldn't be there. So if you think about the subsidies to the agricultural sector, where you first provide free water, you provide free electricity, then you provide fertilizer, then that fertilizer is a bit too much, it spoils the soil, then you incentivize people to grow cereals which we don't need, then we buy up the cereals with another MSP, which a food subsidy, and so on. So a lot of subsidies are distorting and should not be there. Why do we still have a fertilizer subsidy? I mean, we should be giving direct transfers to farmers.
DBTs. Mhm.
The this choice between subsidies and direct benefit transfers, or universal basic income, or maybe not universal, but at least income transfers to the poor,
Select
or at
groups.
least income transfers to farmers, is not happening. Not because it doesn't make sense, it makes perfect sense. It's not happening. Government after government, one regime comes, the other regime comes, because of them not being politically acceptable to whichever party might be in power.
Mhm.
So that, I mean, look at the kind of problem that even a small measure like the new agricultural laws
Yeah.
has been creating. So it is the politics that prevents this rational change in policies rather than good economics.
I hope that answers your question, Tarush. He has another question, but we'll come back to that later after taking questions from other viewers. Arjun has asked us on Twitter, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of India's economic growth rate, as both Congress and BJP are becoming more socialist and populist? And India doesn't have a Vajpayee or a Narasimha Rao like leader, or a Swatantra party which believes in free markets and privatization.
See, I am optimistic about India because not because one party or the other is there, but because actually, even today, regardless of how socialist they become and how much of redistribution they do, but because the bulk of production in India happens in the private sector. Okay? And because the bulk of production happens in the private sector, that is where the dynamism is, that is where the energy is. So what do the socialism of parties do? It takes away part of it and it redistributes it. Okay, that's the socialism. Earlier it used to take away part of it and put it in more infrastructure. Today it takes away part of it, and it whether it was from 2004 onwards, particularly from 2004 onwards, after the India Shining didn't work, then it's more of a realization that we can't get votes if we are not catering to people who live in rural areas, because most of the growth happens in urban areas. So I think that's part of what will continue to happen. Okay. And a lot of economists have argued that this is necessary for social stability. You do need some redistribution as well. So I think that will continue happening. And I don't know whether a Swatantra party, if it was in power, would do the same thing. I mean, so many times one thought that, if it's not the Congress, if it's not the UPA, but the BJP which comes in, then some of these things will change. But I think the BJP has also done redistribution, and that is part of what will happen in India. But coming back to what I said in the beginning, I believe that the fact that production happens primarily in the private sector, other than a small part of the public sector where the inefficiency is, means that resources get allocated optimally. And for an economy to grow, that is the most important thing. I mean, think of why Soviet Union collapsed. Complete collapse, growth stopped going because of bad resource allocation. So I hope that answers your question.
Biaso Thakur does not specify whether he's referring to urban or rural Narega. But see, his question is, do you think 100 days of job or employment will improve the unemployment situation in India, as in reduce the unemployment situation in India?
So there are many kinds of unemployment. You have structural unemployment, you have cyclical unemployment, and you have seasonal unemployment. Now let's look at what effect 100 days, or as many days as you like, has, and what it can attempt to solve. Let's start with structural unemployment. So structural unemployment means that suppose we had let's say we have industrialization, but it is very capital intensive, and that is where all the investment is going, and it's not going to the other sector which is labor intensive. Then increasingly you will have structural unemployment. The structure of the economy will be such that there will be unemployment. Now that is not something that a workfare program can address, because that unemployment is there. Even if what you do is to give a few jobs to a few people for a few 100 days, you're not going to solve the problem of where jobs are being produced and how jobs are being produced in the economy. I mean, that was just a simplifying example. Now you turn to seasonal unemployment. Again, yes, partly you can try to give people employment, but think of rural areas where there's a lot of seasonality due to the cropping, harvesting patterns. Yes, you could try to some extent to give people jobs during those areas, during those bad times. Of course, that seasonality in agriculture will continue, but what you could be trying to do is to give some jobs in the meanwhile. What a workfare program typically tries to address is cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment primarily means that when an economy is going through the ups and downs of the business cycle, then employment changes. In India, we don't have very good current data for employment. In fact, we don't have good data for employment. We look at 5-year data from the NSS or something for employment. A planning commission tried to create a measure, didn't work too well. So if you look at data that comes from, let's say, UK, US, Europe, they get almost weekly data for payroll data, unemployment, people who register for unemployment doles, that kind of data. And what you find is that as the economy goes through ups and downs of the business cycle, so for 2-year or 4-year cycles where the economy picks up investment goes up, then employment moves with the business cycle. And there you'll see that these numbers, the unemployment, those who register on for the dole, those numbers go up and down with the business cycle. And that's the kind of thing that one is trying to address through a workfare program. Now, a little bit on Manrega and whether it has addressed this. You do see some ups and downs in Manrega. Of course, we don't have long enough data to be able to look at the entire after it has been rolled out in the full country. Whether it, how much of co-movement there is with the rest of the business cycle indicators, but we do see some evidence of that.
Thank you, Ila. That was quite elaborate, and I hope that satisfied Biaso. We have another regular viewer who watches many of our shows, Parimal A. Uh, he says, will the urban Manrega put upward pressure? This is a hypothetical question since there is no urban Manrega yet. Upward pressure on industrial wages and make industries, especially SMEs, uncompetitive. Also, has the government and some economists accepted the inability of government to create jobs?
Uh, let's look at the evidence of the rural Manrega, and then I'll give you an answer for this. The rural Manrega was initially where wages were lower. And soon, of course, there was demand that wages should be indexed to the minimum wage in the state. Now, that is, of course, what should be the case, should in terms of when we're talking about what is just. But the effect that it did have was push up rural wages. So the same sort of phenomena is what we might expect for urban wages as well. Now, what it means is that there are many people who work even below the statutory minimum wage. But once you start getting the statutory minimum wage in Manrega, then people are not willing to work below the statutory minimum wage. Now, whether this is a good thing or a bad thing is always a debate and an unsolved problem. Those who are not getting jobs, even in for some reason, or they've completed their Manrega work, may want to work at lower wages, but the pressure then builds up. The way the system builds up is that they won't get jobs. So yes, there may be pressure. It may make SMEs and others who are currently paying wages below the statutory minimum wage, it may make them uncompetitive. I'll not go into whether this is good or bad, because that's more of a judgment that people make. I just want to link this up to one more event that happened uh, with regard to what Manrega did to wages. Uh, and that is to point out that when wages went, when because of Manrega and minimum wages, Punjab saw much less labor. And there are studies that indicate that after the rollout of Manrega in 2012, and because of labor shortages and high wages, you found much less of paddy being, the residue being cut in fields. And part of the reason why we are choking today is one, because of the Water Act that shortened the cropping period for that crop. And second, also because labor became so expensive that people were not willing to hire labor to cut crops. And so they started burning their stubble.
Mhm.
We don't know the consequences of a very large change when we push it through. I think it's very difficult to, when you mess with the market, when you bring in a policy change that's going to affect the country as a whole, it is usually very, very difficult. I don't think this is about the government giving up on trying to create jobs. No government can afford to give up on trying to create jobs, because nobody can afford to pay out a dole to everybody, because where's the tax going to come from? So you can never do that. Nobody, no government can afford to do that. I think it's more the fact that this is a way to give some relief in a difficult time, or as I earlier answered, to address cyclical and seasonal unemployment.
This is Achal Agarwal, and this is an idea which has been talked about here and there. Ila. This public-private partnership. He says, how about exploring the public-private partnership model for Narega?
I think some attempts have been discussed earlier, and I think there were some pilot projects also. I'm not sure about the details of those projects,
Mhm.
but in some places it was tried that you could employ labor to work on your farm, uh, and they would be paid out of Manrega. I'm not sure that it worked very well. But yeah, that's something that people have talked about and looked into. I think we'll need to look more into the details of what is good and what is bad about it. The extent to which uh, this should be the model for uh, 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 creation
So,
of private assets, which is
mhm,
what eventually we're
mhm.
talking about.
This is almost like the government subsidizing job creation in the private sector.
Right. Right. So it has its pros and cons.
Mhm,
I think much more needs to be thought about. Many pilots need to be done
mhm.
so that you kind of don't create scams in the
Yeah,
process.
yeah, yeah. Uh, Anirudh Goel, and I'm very pleasantly surprised that we're getting so many questions about Narega, Ila. Instead of Narega, should the government not consider leasing of uninhabited islands to private developers, and that would obviously bring some revenues.
See, uh, you have to think about many, many, many things in this. So you think of an uninhabited island, it's inhabited by wildlife.
Mhm,
So even before I start talking about whether developers will build hotels and destroy those islands, uh, we have to think about who is living there and what are they doing. There are often places which are uninhabited islands but which have security concerns.
mhm,
So there is a lot of discussion about this, actually, that some uninhabited islands can be but I don't think that, one, it can solve the problem of the country's unemployment as a whole, which is big and everywhere. You will not have people going
mhm,
off to those islands and
mhm,
working. Everybody, how much can they absorb? And second, we want sustainable development. So you'll get some money by selling off an island once. Maybe you'll get some tax revenue. Maybe tomorrow you'll allow some casinos and they'll
mhm.
bring some revenue, like off the shore of
Goa.
Goa or somewhere. But for the country as a whole, let's think about sustainable development models.
Mhm.
Even if we do have one or two islands sold off, and where maybe there's no wildlife at all to be destroyed, um, but let's not find quick solutions.
Kushal Jaisinghani is asking us, do you think we should increase rural Narega instead of urban Narega?
I mean, we should only have a
Rural
rural
Narega. And
narega.
this year they anyway increased the allocation to create more jobs during the lockdown.
Absolutely. So I think that the policy mix, which has been rural narega rather than setting up an urban narega, I think it's the right one, and I hope that they don't change their mind because of political pressure,
Mhm,
because I don't think it's a long term, it's a good strategy at all.
mhm, mhm. Roshan Roy, I don't know the context or the background to this question, but I will ask it anyway. Like, he says, do you think the NDA government is misusing Narega?
In what sense is it misusing Narega? Narega is an employment program. So
Mhm,
what you do have in the news is that a lot more people ask for jobs than the government and the system was able to provide them.
Mhm,
So maybe he's referring to that actually you didn't get all the jobs, because I don't see misuse. I don't understand
mhm,
misuse particularly.
mhm, mhm. And we are running out of time, Ela, so we'll take one last question from Rohit Singh. Uh, why has the NDA government, despite ridiculing Narega in Parliament, not found a better alternative, or introduced something better in its place? Does it imply that Narega is still good and it holds merit?
I think it does because, after all, in 2004, one of the reasons why, what at least what the political scientists attribute the 2009 election victory of the Congress to, one of the reasons was the Narega, which was rolled out by then to many parts of the country. The fact that even after 2014, Mr. Modi continued with Narega, even though it did, the BJP didn't seem to be particularly supporting it earlier, was, I think, because first of all, it was already a right, and I don't think we see many of these things rolled back
Mhm,
very easily. Rolling back something is very, 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 very hard. So that doesn't happen. But the other thing is, just at the risk of repeating myself, is that there is a need for redistribution when you're having growth in a country where you run the risk of leaving a lot of people out. And particularly in this country where we are industrializing, where growth is happening, but more in cities, in industry, in services, we run the risk of leaving rural people out. And you need to find ways to redistribute income to them. So we've had many programs: the toilet building program, the cooking gas program, skill development, yeah, housing, and trying to provide them jobs, which is why Manrega continues
mhm,
as one of the big uh, spending programs of the government. So, this need to redistribute money to the poor, and certainly in a rural Manrega, where it's money going to rural areas, which are not actually getting as much of the benefits of growth, uh, is something that is politically, needed by any government, any party. So I think that's what we are seeing happen here.
mhm. Thank you, Ila. My apologies to Yogesh Dubey and Ayush Patodia. We could not take your questions since we focused exclusively on Narega today. But please do come back. We will take your questions in our coming future episodes. And thank you all for watching this live episode of Elanomics. And we will be back again next Friday with another new one. Please do watch our other videos and subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. Thank you.
Thank you.